The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, when the ground was still hard and the sky carried that particular gray that means winter is not finished with you yet. It came addressed to the agency in Denver, and the agency forwarded it to her in St. Louis, and by the time it reached her hands it had been opened and resealed once already. She did not know by whom, she did not ask. She read it standing at the window of the boarding house where she had lived for 11 months. Below her, a cart horse was having trouble with a patch of ice. The driver was not helping. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs. The man who wrote it stated his age 34. His occupation, cattle rancher 50 miles west of a town called Harlan, Colorado, and his requirements. He needed someone to manage the house. He needed shirts mended and meals prepared and some order kept against the disorder that accumulated when a man lived alone. He said he was not looking for affection. He said that plainly, without apology. He said he was looking for a practical arrangement between two people who understood what frontier life cost and were willing to pay it. She read the letter twice. She had been in America for 4 years. Her English was good, better than good, careful in the way that people are careful with a language they had to earn. She had come from a village outside Stuttgart with her father and her older brother, and then her father had died of a fever in the second winter, and then her brother had married a woman who made it clear. The arrangement was no longer convenient, and then she had been in St. Louis at the boarding house for 11 months, taking in mending, watching the cart horse, reading letters from strangers. She was 26 years old. She had $23 and a sewing basket that had belonged to her mother. She wrote back the same afternoon. She stated her age. She listed what she could do: cook, mend, keep accounts, manage a kitchen garden if the soil permitted. She said she had no objection to hard work. She said she understood what was being offered and what was not. She did not say that $23 was almost gone. She did not say that she had nowhere else to go. She did not say any of the true things because they were not what he had asked for. She sent the letter and then she waited. His reply came in 12 days. It said, "The stage from Pueblo reaches Harlan on Thursdays. I will be there." That was all. She packed what she owned into a trunk that took her an afternoon to fill. The sewing basket she kept out and carried in her hands. She did not look back at the boarding house window when the cab pulled away. The sky on that particular morning was clear, finally. The ice had broken on the river. She was already on her way. The stage from Pueblo took 3 days. She sat with her back straight and her basket on her lap and watched the country change outside the window. The flat eastern plains gave way to something harder, red rock cutting up through scrub, ridgelines that had no softness in them. By the second afternoon, the other passengers had thinned to a drummer in a wool coat and an older woman who slept with her mouth open. By the third morning, she was alone. Harlan appeared the way these towns did, not all at once, but in increments. A water tower, a livery, a row of storefronts with their paint still arguing against the wind. The stage slowed on the main street and stopped at the post office, which also served as the depot. She stepped down before the driver could offer a hand. She set the basket on the boardwalk and turned to watch her trunk come off the roof. It landed hard in the dust. She did not wince. There were people on the street. Not many, but enough. A woman outside the dry goods store had stopped sweeping. 2 men near the saloon had gone still over their conversation. She understood that she was visible. She had prepared herself for visible. He was leaning against the post office wall with his hat in his hands. She knew it was him the way you know certain things, not from any feature she could have described, but from the fact that he was the only person not pretending to look at something else. He was looking directly at her. His hat brim was turning once, slowly, in his fingers. He was not a large man. He was weathered in the way the country was weathered. Not broken, just worked over by time and weather until what was left was only the necessary parts. He crossed the street in 4 steps and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the trunk in the dust. That everything? He said. She said it was. He reached down and picked up the trunk. Not slowly, not with any effort that showed. He simply lifted it and stood. Wagons on the south end, he said, past the livery. She picked up her basket. She walked beside him. He did not ask about the journey. He did not say anything about the town or what she was seeing or what to expect. He walked at a pace that was his pace, and she matched it without adjustment. And that was the whole of their first conversation. The wagon was a flatbed, with 2 horses and a feed sack folded over the seat. He put the trunk in the back. She climbed up on her own side. He went around and got up and gathered the reins. The street was still watching. He turned the horses south toward the open country, and the town fell away behind them. The road south was dry and wide, and said nothing about what lay at the end of it. She held the basket in her lap with both hands and watched the country open around them. The grass ran flat for a distance and then rose in low rolls toward a line of hills that were pale blue in the afternoon light. There were no trees close. A few cottonwoods followed some invisible water far to the west, their tops showing just above the grass line. Silver green and still, he drove without speaking. She did not try to fill it. After a while, she asked how far. He said about an hour if the road held. She nodded and looked back at the hills. The basket sat in her lap. Inside it was a pair of good scissors, a tin of needles, a spool of dark thread, and a small frame photograph wrapped in a square of wool flannel. She had carried those things in her hand across the ocean and across half the country, and she held them now the same way. Not tightly, just with attention. The wagon creaked. The horses moved at an even pace, neither slow nor pushed. He handled the reins with the ease of someone for whom this was not a task, but simply a condition of the afternoon. She watched his hands. They were large and had healed over several times from different kinds of work. The knuckles had been broken at least once. He held the reins with 2 fingers on each side, loose, with just enough tension to read what the horses were thinking. She had not seen hands like that since her father's. She looked back at the road. The ranch came into view from a low rise, a main house, a barn that was newer than the house, a small outbuilding to the north, and a fence line that went out farther than she could see before curving away. A dog stood at the edge of the yard and watched the wagon come without barking. He pulled up at the front of the house and set the brake. The house was plain board and had a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. One of the porch boards was darker than the others. New, recently replaced, the wood not yet weathered to match. She noticed it. She did not say anything. He climbed down and came around, and she had already stepped down and was standing in the yard with the basket. He looked at the house as if reminding himself of something. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "South-facing. Gets the light in the morning." He paused. "There's a boy. 8. He doesn't talk much." He said this last part without explanation, and she understood it was not an apology, only a fact she would need. She looked at the house. "All right," she said. The boy was sitting on the top porch step when they came up the walk. 8 years old, small for it, with his father's stillness already settled into him like something learned early and kept. He had a piece of wood in his hands that he was turning over and over, not carving it, just feeling the grain. He looked up when they came to the steps, and then looked at the piece of wood again. She did not crouch down to him. She did not make her voice smaller. She stood on the bottom step and said, "I'll need to know where the kitchen is." Not to the man, to the boy. The boy looked up again. He considered this. Then he stood and went inside, and she followed, and that was the introduction. The kitchen was at the back of the house, east-facing, with a window that had no curtain, a work table of rough pine, a cast-iron stove well used but clean. Someone had kept it, even recently. A hook near the door with a man's coat on it, and a smaller hook beside it with nothing. She set her basket on the work table and looked at what was in the room and began to understand the shape of it. There was flour, salt, 3 eggs in a bowl, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth. She found a pot and a skillet on the shelf beside the stove, and she found the wood stacked behind the back door, and she built the fire herself. The man came in and saw what she was doing and said nothing. He sat down at the table. The boy sat across from him. They did not speak to each other. It was not uncomfortable between them. It was something else. A quietness that had grown up to fill the space where something used to be. She cooked bacon and eggs and corn porridge from a jar of meal she found on the top shelf. She set the plates without ceremony and sat down at the end of the table, which she had taken to be the right place, and they ate. She ate with them. That was not discussed. When the boy was done, he put his fork down and looked at the basket on the work table. At the edge of it, the corner of the blue cloth she kept her needles in was visible. He did not point, did not ask, just looked, she said. It's for mending. Matter of fact, like weather. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time. Something moved in his face, and then it was still again. After supper, she washed the plates, and the man dried them without being asked, standing beside her at the basin, and she was aware of how much space he took up and how careful he was not to take more than his share of it. The boy watched from the doorway. He left before she noticed he was gone. The next morning, she found a nail on the porch rail, not driven in. Just laid there, square-headed, slightly rusted, the way a thing gets set down when someone is not sure yet what to do with it. She looked at it for a moment, then left it where it was. She had hung her sewing basket on the porch the evening before. The hook inside was overcrowded, and there was better light out here in the mornings. The nail was about the right height, about the right weight for the job. She did not mention it at breakfast. He did not mention it either. But when she came back from the well with the water bucket, the nail was driven in. Clean, flush, angled just enough to hold. She hung the basket on it. It held without shifting. That was the first week. The boy began to appear at the edges of her work, not underfoot. He had too much self-possession for that, but present. He would sit on the porch step with something in his hands, a stone or a length of twine, occupying himself with the performance of not watching. She let him perform it. She worked through the pile that had accumulated over what she guessed was a long time. A shirt with a collar worn nearly to nothing, a pair of dungarees with a knee blown out, a canvas jacket with 3 buttons missing, and one more hanging by a thread. On the third day, the boy said, "That was my mother's basket." She kept her needle moving. Let the sentence be what it was. "I know," she said, because she had guessed it. He turned the stone over in his hands. "She had a thimble," he said. "Silver one. I don't know where it went." She reached into the blue cloth without looking and set her own thimble on the step beside him. Brass, not silver, worn smooth on one side. He picked it up and looked at it like he was doing arithmetic. "You can hold it," she said. "Just don't lose it." He held it for the rest of the morning. At noon, the man came in from the far field with his shirt untucked on one side and a long tear along the pike. Shoulder seam, the kind that comes from catching on something at speed. He did not make anything of it, just set his hat on the hook and washed his hands and sat down. She looked at the tear. He saw her look. Neither of them said anything. After lunch, she threaded a needle with linen and waited. He sat at the table with his coffee going cold, and finally, without being asked, pulled the shirt over his head and handed it across. She worked without looking up. He sat there in the afternoon light with his forearms on the table, patient as stone. The boy came in and saw them like that and said nothing at all. She finished the shoulder seam and held the shirt up to the window to check the line. The thread was linen, close in color to the original weave, and if you were not looking for the repair, you would not see it. He was looking. She handed it across, and he turned it in his hands the way a man checks a joint he did not make himself. Not doubting, just reading. He put it back on without a word, tucked it in on the side it had come untucked, and reached for his hat. He stopped at the door. You've got a good hand for it, he said. He did not look back when he said it. He was already angling toward the door, already thinking about the far field or the fence line or whatever the afternoon held. But he had said it, and it sat in the room after he left the way a stone sits in still water. No splash, just presence. The boy had drifted to the window to watch him cross the yard. She wound the remaining thread onto the spool and set it in the basket beside the beat thimble she had loaned out that morning. She had not asked for it back. It was probably still in the boy's pocket. That evening he came in later than usual, and when he washed up, she noticed the knuckle on his right hand was split and had bled and dried. He had wrapped it at some point with a strip of something, and the strip had slipped. She set a clean cloth and the small tin of salve on the edge of the basin without comment. He looked at it. He did not say anything. She was at the stove when she heard him open the tin. The three of them ate, and the boy talked about a hawk he had seen sitting on the top rail of the near fence, just sitting, not hunting, just there. He described how it turned its head. He used his hands. The man listened with the same attention he gave everything, complete and still. Hawks sit when they're satisfied, the man said. The boy considered this. How do you know when a hawk is satisfied? It stops moving. The boy thought about that through the rest of supper. She cleared the plates, and the boy eventually went up. She could hear him overhead, the small, reliable sounds of a child settling. The man sat at the table with his hands around his cup. The knuckle had been rewrapped, the cloth straight this time, the salve smell faint in the warm kitchen. She had one more shirt to mend, his other one, the dark canvas, where a button had pulled free and taken a thread of the buttonhole weave with it. She had been putting it off, because the weave was tight and the repair would take time. She took it from the basket and spread it across her lap. He did not move to leave. The lamp on the table threw a low circle of light. Beyond it the kitchen was dim, the window dark, the yard outside reduced to nothing. She threaded her needle. The canvas was heavy between her fingers, exactly as resistant as she had expected, and she found the damaged buttonhole by touch before she looked at it directly. The weave had pulled in a small radius around the break. She would have to work back toward the intact threads, anchor there, rebuild outward. He turned his cup once on the table, set it back in the same place. The fire had settled into coals. She could hear it ticking. She did not look up from the shirt. He did not speak. The silence between them had been accumulating for weeks now and had stopped feeling like the absence of something. It had become a thing in itself, specific, with a particular weight, not uncomfortable but not light either. She worked the needle through. Once, again, the thread was dark, close to the color of the canvas, and she had cut it longer than she usually would because she did not want to stop and rethread in the middle. He shifted in his chair, not to leave, just to settle. "You've done this before," he said. She did not look up. "Mending?" "Staying." She pulled the thread through and held it. The needle caught a small point of lamplight. "I was with a family in Abilene," she said. 2 years, before I answered the advertisement. He waited. "They were good people," she said. "The woman was sick most of the second year. I stayed until she didn't need me to." He was quiet for a moment. "And after?" She found the next thread and set the needle. "After I read the advertisement." It was not the whole of it. He seemed to understand that it was not the whole of it, and he did not ask for more. The fire ticked. She worked 3 more passes into the buttonhole, feeling the weave accept the new thread slowly, the way damaged cloth always did, with resistance first, then a kind of recognition. "The boy," she said after a while. "He asked me this morning if hawks have names." She felt him consider this. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." She glanced up briefly. "He seemed to think you would." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, closer to something being set down gently. "I'll tell him they probably do," he said. "Just not names we'd understand." She looked back at the shirt. The buttonhole was holding. Another 4 passes, and she would anchor the thread, and it would be done, and she would fold the shirt, and that would be the end of the work for the night. He did not reach for his coat. She did not suggest he should. She anchored the thread with 4 small passes, clipped the tail close, and turned the buttonhole once to check the weave. It held. She folded the shirt along its original crease lines, the way the cloth remembered, and set it on the side table. The fire had dropped to coals. Neither of them moved to add wood. She picked up the next piece from the basket, a pair of work trousers, the left knee worn through entirely. She held them up toward the lamp to see the extent of it. "That's from the fence line," he said, "last month." She did not respond, only turned the fabric to find where the weave was still sound enough to anchor a patch. The damage was larger than it looked from the front. It always was. She set the trousers across her knee and sorted through the basket for matching weight. She had learned in the first week that he owned nothing in matching weight. Every garment a different year, a different origin. The patching was always a negotiation between what she had and what would hold. He watched her work in the way he had watched her work before, not intrusively. From a certain distance, the way a person watches weather approach across open country, with interest, without urgency. "You've done this a long time," he said. It was not a question. "Since I was 8, she said. "My mother was a seamstress. I was the second pair of hands." She felt him absorb this. "She teach you the rest of it? The cooking?" "My grandmother. She found a piece of heavy cotton duck that would do for the knee and began trimming it to shape. She said, a woman who could feed people and mend what they wore would never be without a place. She was right. She was practical," she said. "It's not the same thing." The scissors made a clean sound against the cloth. Outside, the wind had come up. She could hear it moving around the corner of the house, finding the gaps. The lamp flame leaned slightly without going out. "Your grandmother," he said after a while. "She still living?" "No." She did not look up. "She died the winter before I came over." He said nothing. She did not need him to. She pinned the patch in place and threaded a new needle, heavier gauge for the canvas. The first stitch was always the one that set the angle for all the rest. She placed it carefully, feeling the resistance of the layered cloth, and drew the thread through. The wind moved again. He shifted in the chair, not to leave, just to settle. "The boy goes to sleep with the lamp on," she said, not looking up. "I've been leaving it low. I hope that's—" "It's fine," he said, quiet and immediate as though he'd been waiting to say it. She kept her eyes on the stitch. The candle on the windowsill had burned down to its last quarter-inch. She had not replaced it, had told herself she would each morning, and each morning found something else that needed doing first. The habit of it, the small persistence of light against the dark glass, had become something she was unwilling to interrupt. She finished the first row of stitching and turned the canvas in her lap. The patch held. She ran her thumb along the seam to feel where the tension lived, pressing gently until she found the place she wanted. Then she began again. He had not moved from the chair. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of the wind, not watching, but present in her attention. "How long were you in the war?" she said. It came out without planning. She kept her eyes on the cloth, a pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "3 years," he said. "Give or take a month either direction." She drew the thread through. "Which side?" "The Union." She nodded, not looking up. "My father thought the war would come to nothing," she said. He was wrong about most things. Something shifted in the room. Not tension. Something lighter than tension. Most people were, he said. She set 2 more stitches, feeling the cloth give the way she wanted it to. Outside, the wind had dropped to something slower, less urgent. She could hear the lamp's faint hiss. You came here after, she said, not a question. Year after mustering out. He paused. Land was cheap and I didn't have anywhere else to be. She understood that. She had not said it to herself in exactly those words, but it was why she had come to, not towards something, simply because there had been nowhere else. The boy, she said after a moment. He asked me today if the cows have names. She heard something change in his breath. Not quite a laugh, close to one. What did you tell him? I told him some do and some don't, and that the ones who do know the difference. This time he did laugh, quiet, low, nothing performed about it. She felt it move through her like warmth from a stove you didn't know you were, standing near until you stepped away from it. She tied off the thread and held the canvas up to check the patch by lamplight. The seam was clean. The angle she had set with the first stitch had held all the way through. She lowered it to her lap. He was still looking at her. She could feel it without turning. She smoothed the canvas once with her palm, feeling the texture of the repaired cloth under her hand. The old and the new stitched together, holding. She did not turn, but she did not look away from him either. The lamp burned low between them. She set the canvas on the table and did not reach for another piece of work. Her hands stayed in her lap, one over the other, the way she had learned to hold them when she was a girl. And the pastor spoke too long, and she was not allowed to fidget. She had unlearned many things from that time. She had not unlearned that. He was quiet, too, the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like absence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not the violent kind, but the low, persistent kind that pressed against the siding and found every gap it could. She had stuffed the gap beneath the front door with a strip of old canvas her first week she had not asked. He had noticed it a few days later and said nothing, only nodded once at the floor as he passed. That nod had meant something. She had not been sure what, exactly. She was beginning to understand that this was how it worked with him. Meaning arrived slowly, and you had to hold it loosely, and eventually it settled into shape. The step, he said. She waited. Third one from the top. It's been soft since spring. I've been meaning. She looked toward the staircase. She had known about the step. She had learned to place her foot to the left of center, where the board was still firm. She had not mentioned it. I'll get to it this week, he said. She nodded, not because the step required a response, because he had offered it like something else entirely, and she wanted him to know she had received it in the way it was meant. He stood and gathered the lamp from the table, not taking it, leaving it, adjusting the wick so it would burn through without running dry. A small thing. She watched his hands do it with the same economy she had come to associate with everything he did, the way he moved through the world, as though motion itself was something to be used carefully and not wasted. "Good night," he said. "Good night." He crossed to the stairs. She heard his boots on the treads, 1, 2, and then the pause on the third where he shifted his weight to the left. Without thinking, he had learned it too. She did not know when. She had not seen him do it before tonight. She sat in the lamplight after his footsteps moved down the hall and stopped. The house settled around her. The wind, the low sound of one of the horses shifting in the barn, the boy asleep above her, quiet in the way children are quiet when they feel safe enough to stop guarding themselves in sleep. She did not reach for another piece of mending. She stayed where she was a little longer than she needed to. In the morning, she found the loose board on the back step had been fixed. Not replaced, the same board, set back true and spiked with 2 new nails, the heads flush with the grain. She had stepped over that board for 11 weeks. She stood on it now and pressed her weight down, and it did not give, and she stood there a moment, longer than the test required. She went inside and started the fire. He came down before the boy. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, checking the window latch without looking like he was checking it, pouring water into the basin, not speaking until the coffee was on. She did not mention the step. He did not mention it either. He sat at the table and pulled his hat from the peg and turned it once in his hands and set it down again, the way he did when he was not in a hurry to be anywhere. The boy came down with one boot on and the other in his hand and sat at the table and worked at the lace with more concentration than it required. She set the bread out. She poured the coffee. She sat. They ate. It was the kind of quiet that had taken weeks to build, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that did not need filling. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and she could hear the leaves. She had not noticed them before. She noticed them now. After he left, she stood at the window and watched him cross the yard toward the barn. The boy ran after him with something in his fist, a carved figure, a horse, one of the ones from the shelf, and held it up, and the man crouched down and looked at it carefully, the way he did when the boy showed him things, with his full attention. Not the patience of obligation. Something else. He said something she could not hear. The boy nodded with his whole body. He looked up once before he went into the barn. Not at her, at the house, at the window, or the step, or the roof line. She was not certain which. His eyes moved across it, the way a person's eyes move across something they are measuring, or considering, or deciding something about. Then he went inside, and the door swung behind him on its hinge. The boy came back across the yard, still holding the horse. He climbed the fixed step without breaking stride. He sat down at the table and set the horse on the edge of it, facing out toward the window. She picked up the coffee cups. She set them in the basin. Through the window, the barn door stood open, light moving across the hay-scattered floor in a long, pale band. She washed the cups slowly. The water in the basin had gone cool. She did not heat more. She stood at the window and watched the band of light across the barn floor and listened to the sounds that came from inside. The low voice, the boy's answering laugh, the measured knock of wood being worked. It was not the sound she had expected when she came here. She had not expected much. She had understood the arrangement clearly enough. Shirts, meals, a house that needed order. She had been grateful for the plainness of it, because plainness was something she could hold and not be afraid of. Plainness did not disappear. She dried the cups and set them on the shelf. The boy's laugh came again through the open barn door. She stood still a moment with the cloth in her hands. She had crossed an ocean. She had crossed half a continent after that. She had sat on a train bench with a bag at her feet and a name on a paper, and she had said the name to herself until it meant nothing, until it was only sound. She had stood on a platform in the wind and looked at a man she had never seen and thought, "This is the shape of it now." Not with grief, not with courage, with the particular resignation of a person who has run out of other options and found, in that running out, a kind of peace. She folded the cloth and laid it on the basin's edge. Through the window the light shifted. A cloud, maybe, or the hour moving. The barn door still stood open. She thought about the step, fixed without announcement, the way he had looked at her when she set the plate in front of him the first morning. Not with warmth, not yet, but with attention. The particular attention of a person noticing someone for the first time as a real thing and not a solution to a problem. She had been noticed before. It had not always meant anything. This felt different in a way she did not try to name. She went to the table and sat down. The carved horse stood on the edge of it, facing the window. She touched it once, with one finger. The wood smooth. Someone had spent time on it. You could feel the time in the grain. The boy's voice rose and fell in the barn. The man's answered. She left her hand beside the horse and looked at the window and the light in the open door and the long, pale band crossing the hay-scattered floor. Outside, the wind moved through the grass at the far edge of the yard. She was not waiting. She was simply sitting at the table in the house where she lived, in the quiet of an ordinary morning, with her hand open beside a small carved horse.